Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into the roaring 1920s to look at HBO's incredibly ambitious prohibition drama, Boardwalk Empire. Created by Emmy Award winner Terrence Winter and inspired by Nelson Johnson's nonfiction book about historical criminal kingpin Enoch L. Johnson, this show was an absolute titan of television. Following in the monumental footsteps of foundational series like The Sopranos and The Wire, this was HBO boldly planting its flag in a brand new decade of prestige TV. We're going to do a deep dive into its factual, behind-the-scenes history, and we're also going to explore a really fascinating critical debate surrounding its overall narrative arc.
Okay, let's dive into this structural roadmap for today. We'll start with building the empire, then move on to the premise and players, before analyzing the Season 2 peak. Finally, we'll look at life after Jimmy and wrap things up with the show's legacy.
Kicking things off with Section 1, Building the Empire.
$18 million. Just wrap your head around that for a second. That was the final production cost of the pilot episode alone. Series creator Terrence Winter, coming off his tremendous success as an executive producer on The Sopranos, teamed up with legendary Academy Award-winning director Martin Scorsese to establish this world. It was a massive undertaking and honestly, a staggering gamble for HBO. Committing this level of upfront funding to a single pilot was virtually unheard of at the time, which really highlights just how much risk the network was willing to take to solidify its absolute dominance in original storytelling.
And, Scorsese really saw the immense potential in that massive gamble. As his words here highlight, he viewed premium cable as the ultimate space for long-form character development, and the sheer magnitude of his involvement cannot be overstated. This pilot marked the very first time Martin Scorsese had directed an episode of television since way back in 1986. He was drawn to the freedom of the medium and the ability to create another world entirely from scratch, setting a masterful visual template that literally every subsequent director for this series would emulate.
To put that level of commitment into perspective, $5 million of that pilot budget went into building a literal 300-foot-long, 45-foot-wide replica of the Atlantic City Boardwalk in a totally empty lot in Brooklyn, New York. To make the environment feel completely authentic, the visual effects company spent 2 rigorous months using archival photographs and original architectural plans just to digitally extend the physical set. Meanwhile, the costume designer was out there sourcing actual 1920s tailoring books to design these meticulously detailed wardrobes. The scale of this production was simply breathtaking.
Which brings us perfectly into Section 2, the premise and players. The chronological scope of this series is just massive. Spanning an entire decade, it kicks off right at the dawn of Prohibition in 1920, with Season 1 tracking the initial chaotic setup of the bootlegging industry. Fast forward to Season 4, and we're immersed in 1924, deep into the Jazz Age and the absolute height of organized crime's grip on the country. Finally, Season 5 takes a massive 7-year time jump to 1931, as the Great Depression is raging and Prohibition is nearing its inevitable end. It's a remarkable, decade-long evolution of American history right before our eyes. And this brilliantly illustrates the core dynamic that fueled the show's early magic. On one side, we have Steve Buscemi's Nucky Thompson, the brain. He's the corrupt treasurer of Atlantic County, right? A shrewd political figure and businessman desperately seeking legitimacy in a totally illegitimate world. On the other side, we have Michael Pitt's Jimmy Darmody, the Heart. He's a Princeton dropout and a World War I veteran who returned from the trenches damaged, volatile, and looking to be far more than just Nucky's driver. Their contrasting motivations created this incredibly rich friction that drove the entire early plot of the series forward.
Now, when we talk about Jimmy being the heart, we mean he literally represents the emotional core of the narrative. An analytical perspective points out that Jimmy, alongside his friend Richard Harrow, a former Army marksman so physically disfigured in the war that he wears a painted tin mask over half his face, they represented the show's deeply tragic thesis on what America did to its young soldiers. These were men sent off to brutal, unimaginable combat, only to return to a society that had completely moved on and simply had no place for them. Their struggle to find purpose in a broken world was devastatingly real, and it added a very necessary layer of sorrow to all the glitz and glamour of the Roaring '20s.
Moving into Section 3, the Season 2 peak. We're going to shift our tone to be a bit more analytical here as we approach a really pivotal, highly debated moment in television history. Did Boardwalk Empire peak early? It's a highly compelling question, right? Because while the show absolutely maintains significant critical acclaim throughout its entire run, there's a very prominent critical perspective out there that suggests the series reached its absolute creative zenith at the very end of its second season. Let's delve into exactly why some viewers make this argument.
It all revolves around the Season 2 finale, famously titled To the Lost. It is a distinctly Shakespearean climax. Jimmy goes to meet Nucky in the pouring rain at the War Memorial to establish a truce.
genuinely believing they're family again. Instead, in a shocking, cold-blooded betrayal of his former protege and surrogate son, Nucky embraces Jimmy and then shoots him twice in the face. It was a staggering television moment that fundamentally altered the show's DNA forever.
This brings us to a fascinating, critical perspective, beautifully summarized by this quote: "Boardwalk Empire is a 5-season show that peaked exactly when it killed its heart." Some analysts argue that by killing Jimmy Darmody, the narrative lost the electric, tragic energy of its first 2 years. And losing that energy mattered deeply, because Jimmy was the vital tether that connected the audience's empathy to the show's otherwise cold, criminal underworld. Without him, the series transitioned into something entirely different, colder, more cynical, and arguably much harder to connect with on an emotional level. Let's break down exactly why some fans feel this way regarding Jimmy's departure. The loss of the emotional core was immediate. While Nucky was a fascinating intellectual study, Jimmy was raw and deeply relatable. This tied directly into the end of the father-son dynamic. Seasons 1 and 2 were heavily built on this Oedipal struggle of sons trying to overthrow their surrogate fathers. Without Jimmy, that intense generational conflict was exceptionally hard to replace, leaving Nucky somewhat isolated narratively. Plus, the lingering ghosts of the trenches and the World War I trauma largely faded from the central storyline. Finally, Michael Pitt just brought this volatile, unpredictable on-screen presence that simply couldn't be replicated.
So, how do you rebuild a show after completely eliminating your emotional center? That's Section 4, Life After Jimmy.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the narrative physically and structurally pivoted. While the early seasons were deeply intimate, focused on father-son betrayal and localized primarily within the tight-knit world of Atlantic City boardwalk politics, seasons 3 through 5 sprawled outward. The scope expanded significantly to Chicago, New York, Tampa, and Harlem. To sustain this much wider lens, the show adopted what you might call a villain of the year format. This brought in incredible network-style seasonal antagonists like the psychopathic Jep Rossetti and the icy, calculating Dr. Narcisse.
And you can actually see a correlation when we impartially look at the viewership data from Nielsen Media Research. We can track a gradual, steady decline in average audience numbers over time. The show started incredibly strong with over 3 million viewers in Season 1, but by the time we hit the sprawling narrative of Season 3, it dropped to 2.32 million, eventually landing right around 2 million by Season 5. It's important to emphasize that while the show remained a prestige heavy hitter with critics, this data highlights that high-end prestige doesn't always equal sustained mass viewership. Analysts strongly correlate this steady decline to the show's shift away from a deeply personal, intimate tragedy toward a more sprawling, historically distant procedural.
This sprawling storyline eventually culminated in what some critics called a rush job for Season 5. Reduced from the premium standard of 12 episodes down to just 8, the final season utilized a massive 7-year time jump to 1931. To close the emotional loop, it focused heavily on flashbacks to Nucky's youth to justify his tragic end. In the series finale, Nucky is gunned down by a young man who reveals himself to be Tommy Darmody, the orphaned son of Jimmy. It was a moment of striking poetic justice. Having Tommy pull the trigger served as a definitive, fatal consequence for Nucky's past sins, neatly tying a narrative bow on the generational trauma that was established all the way back in Season 1. But taking a step back from the debates over pacing or narrative structure, let's look at the big picture. Section 5, the show's legacy. 57. That is an absolutely staggering number, and it represents the primetime Emmy Award nominations the series received over its 5-season run, ultimately taking home an incredible 20 wins. To summarize this massive achievement, we're talking about a Golden Globe for Best Drama in 2011 and 2 Screen Actors Guild Awards for its incredible ensemble cast. Look, beyond the narrative critiques we've explored today, the sheer production value, those groundbreaking visual effects, and the universally acclaimed acting, from Steve Buscemi to Kelly MacDonald to Michael Shannon's completely unforgettable turn as a straight-laced agent turned bootlegger, it all ensured its place in the prestige television pantheon. Ultimately, these elements set an entirely new standard for how cinematic, detailed, and expansive historical dramas on television could be. So, I want to leave you with this provocative question to ponder. Does a show's creative peak always align with its commercial success? Or is a brilliant, tragic downfall, like the shocking demise of Jimmy Darmody, its own kind of enduring legacy? It really makes you think about the fascinating relationship between bold narrative risk, character death, and television history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the stories behind the stories.